Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers Podcast, your source for travel stories, travel destinations, and travel philosophy.
I'm Amanda.
I'm Ryan.
And we're your hosts. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. We're super excited for today's episode because we've got an awesome guest here with us today, Gary Arndt. And Gary is an amazing travel photographer. He's been traveling for nearly 10 years, so he's easily the most traveled person we've ever had the privilege of having on the show. And we had the opportunity to see Gary speak when we were at the TBEX Travel Conference in Manila back in the fall, and he dropped some massive value bombs about being an authority in the travel industry, and it really inspired us to reach out to him and see if we could have a deeper conversation about travel. So we talk about everything from travel photography to travel blogging to how to live a life that's meaningful to you, whether or not it's travel or maybe it's stopping travel. And so without further ado, here's Gary.
We are very excited to be joined today by Gary Arndt, the founder of Everything Everywhere. Gary is certainly the most well-traveled person we've had in the 100-plus episodes of this show, so we're very excited to have him on and hear about his adventures of traveling around for almost 10 years continuously now. So welcome to the show, Gary.
Thanks for having me.
So the first place we thought we'd start would be rewinding. On your blog, you have the start date for this big trip as March 2007. So approaching the 10-year anniversary, and we thought it would be cool to rewind and hear the story of kicking off this trip and how it came about.
I had started an internet company back in the 90s, and I sold it, and I'd started some other companies, and one I was just an investor in, the other was doing great, but we started it just kind of in the middle of when all the dot-com stuff kind of fell apart. So that kind of died. And then I went back to school for 2 years, studied geology, and I didn't really know what to do. So I came up with the idea of traveling around the world, and I thought I would travel around the world for a year or two. So I got the idea in 2005, and it kind of took me that long to unwind everything, sell my house, get rid of stuff. And I thought I'd travel for a year or two, and it kind of became 10.
Yeah, it's funny how so many people we've talked to have like a similar, not to that extent, but I went for like a 4-month trip and now it's been 2 years. It doesn't seem to have an end date in sight.
Right.
What were people at home, like your family, your peers, former coworkers? What were they thinking when you were like, I'm just going to sell everything, I'm going to take off and spend a couple of years traveling?
Nobody said anything to my face. I'm sure some of them probably thought I was nuts, but I've never had a real job. I never had coworkers. I started a business when I was pretty close out of college. And so I never, was in a position where I was like, working for a salary or something. So people, I think I've always kind of done my own thing, and people just kind of accepted the fact that that's kind of what I did. So when I announced I was doing this, it was just another crazy Gary idea, and I think people just kind of went, all right.
Yeah, that's great. I think we can both definitely relate to that. I feel like people are now starting to be like our parents are like, oh, okay, now you're doing this. That's interesting. Go do your thing. So what was it when you got on the road that has kind of kept you traveling? Like, what did you love about traveling when you started?
The travel has changed over time. When I got started, and I think everybody experiences this, you're really excited. You're on the road. You're going to these places that you've never been to before. And I was not a well-traveled person. My family never traveled anywhere. I never saw saltwater till I was 21 years old. I never... my family took a trip to Canada once, going to Niagara Falls, and that was the sum total of my international travel experience. I didn't leave North America till I was 29, I'm sorry. I convinced the company I sold my business to send me on an around the world trip. And I got to go at a 3-week whirlwind tour where I went to, Tokyo, Taipei, Singapore, Brussels, Frankfurt, London, and that kind of stuck with me. So, when it started, there's just that excitement about seeing all this stuff. And then eventually the excitement wears off, and it really just kind of becomes the ability to learn new things. I've always liked learning. It's why I went back to school as an adult after I'd gotten a degree, because I simply always enjoy being in new places and learning new things.
Yeah, and so photography and writing have become a big part of your, I guess, I was going to use the word career, but just like since you've started traveling and built a successful blog around it, were those passions that you had prior to travel, or were those things that kind of like developed out of travel?
I knew absolutely nothing about photography when I started traveling. I made the mistake of buying a very expensive camera that I didn't know how to use, and then I took a lot of very bad photos, and the only saving grace I had is that I knew they were bad. I had read enough, I collect National Geographic magazines. I have a very extensive collection. I've seen enough photos that I knew that what I was doing was not what I was seeing in the pages of these magazines. So I just kind of underwent a process of trying to figure out why my photos suck and then trying to make them not suck.
That's awesome to hear. I feel like more people should be doing that, especially with like the days of Instagram and stuff now. I mean, myself included. What were some of the things that really helped you to improve your photography? Because your photography is amazing.
It's an iterative process. I remember taking photos from the first 2 years I traveled, some of which I was very proud of, and I look back on them now and I just cringe. I so want to go and just redo my first 2 years of travel so I can reshoot it, and so nobody can see all that bad stuff. A lot of it was learning to use my camera, edit photos, and then it's just practice, practice, practice. You can have a child that can play a tune on the piano, and they'll kind of do it ham-fisted, and they'll do the notes in order. But just because they're doing the notes in order doesn't mean that they're making beautiful music. And what it took me a long time was to know when I see something, this is what I have to do. This is what I want to have the camera settings at. And to just instinctively and intuitively know what I want the image to look like in my mind to then create that with the camera and on my desktop. And that's just something you kind of learn over time.
Do you feel like having a good camera has been kind of like a key piece to that puzzle?
The problem with that is a lot of people think that, I need a good camera. Here's the problem is all cameras now are good. There are no bad cameras. You can, if your lighting is good, you can take a good picture on anything. I have 2 cameras that I carry with me. One is a Sony A7R II, which is like a $4,000 camera. And the other is a Sony A6000, which is, I think it sells for a little under $400 now. And I can take almost the same identical shots with both cameras. So the question is, well, why do I have one other than the other? It's because the other one can do things in situations that the other one can't. And so when you talk about having a good camera, unless you know exactly what that camera is going to get you over another camera, there's really no point in buying it. And I hear people all the time, it's like, we're going to buy a better camera. It's like, well, what for? What's it going to do that your current camera can't do? And they don't know. It's not going to magically take a better picture. If you're just shooting in automatic and in JPEG, there's absolutely no reason to buy a better camera because it's not going to take a better picture because you don't know how to use the camera. So the reason I bought that $4,000 camera is so I can take better photos in low light. When I'm in a temple or a church or a cave or something like that, I can now take shots that I couldn't take before. And that is specifically why I got that camera. But unless you know that that's the thing you want to do, getting the more expensive camera is not really going to help you.
Do you feel like a lot of people overestimate the kind of like technical side of photography and underestimate the kind of like soft skill part of it?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of great photographers will say it's not the camera, it's the photographer. And people say all the time, they see my photos, it's like, you have a great camera. And it's like, I take bad photos with this camera, trust me. And I've done this on tours where I've let people use my camera. It's like, here, you take it, take some shots with it, and I will take your camera. Let's see what we can do. And what I will do is I will adjust some settings on their camera to my liking, and I'll take some photos and I'll put them on my laptop and I'll edit them, and I can take images that are pretty much the same as I could have taken on my camera. And they go, well, how did you do that? I'm just like, well, that's what I'm saying. It's not the camera. Most cameras can take pretty good photos. It's going to be the lens, or it's something else, or just knowing, most SLRs or high-end mirrorless cameras, or even entry-level SLRs, there's all sorts of knobs and dials and buttons on it. And most people have no idea what the knobs and dials and buttons do. And they're there for a reason. And once you get to know what they do and kind of understand, and this is not rocket science, it's actually pretty simple. And it's just practice, practice, practice. And then when you have a certain scene, what the knobs and dials and buttons all need to be at for you to take a good photo.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear. It's kind of like what I've thought about cameras, but it's cool to hear that from somebody who is actually a photographer, since I'm not. I was like, I don't know if I'm just being cheap. I feel like this is what I think, but like if I spend $2,000 on a camera that I don't know how to work any better than I know how to work a point and shoot, it's not really going to assist me anymore because my skills haven't changed.
I can take very good photos with my iPhone. The cameras have gotten better on the phones, to be true. But the techniques and everything you use on a smartphone are exactly the same as what you use on a bigger camera. They're no different. And a lot of it's like saying, if you read something that someone wrote, to then say, wow, you got a great keyboard. Yeah. The keyboard doesn't matter. It's just a tool. And yes, some keyboards might make you more efficient in writing. They might, reduce stress or something, but it's not going to make you a better writer. And the same is true with photography. Yeah. Maybe not quite as dramatic as that example, but the principle's the same.
Yeah, we were in Myanmar recently, and obviously a very photogenic place, and took quite a few photos and had a couple friends reach out to us and were like, oh, wow, you guys are taking great photos lately. Like, what have you guys mixed up? Kind of looking for like some sort of technical tips, and we're like, oh, we just like went to Myanmar and went out and watched a lot of sunsets. That's what changed. But it's one of the great things about travel. You have all these amazing locations, which makes a big difference for the photos as well.
The number one travel photography tip I give people is put yourself in front of beautiful things. If you're in a place that is not photogenic, you're not going to take great photos. I don't care who you are. The great photographers get out there, and they're there at the right time of year, the right time of day. They have patience. They wait for conditions to be right, and then they press the button. And it's not just you can go there any time of day and press the button and get the same sort of photo.
Yeah, I saw a photo the other day. It was from somewhere in Banff National Park, and someone had lined up a kayak on a lake. There's a big mountain in the background. So the lake's like perfectly still, glass. The light's perfectly right so that the reflection is completely symmetrical with the mountain, and then the kayak is also perfectly straight. And they've got it all symmetrical. I'm like, that must have just taken ages to figure out and to go out and wait for that perfect moment, probably up at an ungodly hour as well. So yeah, it's just a lot of work goes into setting it up perfectly. You can't, the number of bad shots you're going to take to get that one shot might be quite large, depending on, the conditions. I just was out photographing polar bears in November, and especially with wildlife. You can't control the wildlife. They won't pose for you. So you're going to take... That's not what the polar bears do?
No, so you're going to take a lot of photos, and you may, put it in high speed mode where you're going... you take 12 photos in the hopes that during that fraction of a second, they're going to pose or look at you or be positioned in such a way that that's what you want. And, they might not do it as well.
I'm curious what's changed for you over the course of 10 years in terms of this, like what stuff you like to photograph. Does that question register with you?
It's not the stuff I like to photograph. I photograph everything: people, wildlife, landscapes, urban areas. I just find myself, when I started, well, I guess I went to some weird places when I started traveling too. I started in the Pacific, and I was going to places like the first countries I visited were like Samoa, Tonga, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. But now I find myself like, okay, I'm going to go to this remote part of the Arctic in Canada. There's this particular island in the Aleutian Islands I want to go to, stuff like that.
Okay, so finding places that aren't as like well photographed by other travelers or other travel photographers.
But it's not an issue of the photography. It's just that's where I want to go as a traveler. And there will certainly be interesting things to photograph. So one of the things I'd like to visit is a small little place called Round Island in Alaska. But the reason I want to go is because it's a huge area for walruses.
Oh, cool.
And most people have not seen a walrus in the wild, let alone an entire beach full of walruses. So that's something I would very much like to do. There will certainly be photographic opportunities, but that's, again, not necessarily the point of it.
Right. You kind of touched on something that somebody asked us in a travel hangout that we hosted. They asked us if we were, the more we traveled, if we were more interested in finding like more remote locations that people hadn't been to. I know you said that you started with some places that are kind of off the beaten path, but have you found that where you like to go has changed towards places that not as many people have been?
I've always been interested in that. But I think that having traveled now, for example, I have absolutely nothing against Thailand, nothing whatsoever. But everybody goes there, right? The world does not need another backpacking blog about going through Thailand. We don't. And it's also kind of weird for me because I'm a middle-aged white guy. When I go to Thailand and other parts of the world, there's a lot of creepy guys that go there. Yeah. And it's always kind of uncomfortable for me doing that. So it's just, I think that if you want to be successful as a blogger or as a photographer, you have to stand apart from the crowd because there's so many people doing this. And if you want to stand apart from the crowd, you have to not do what everyone else is doing. And it's as simple as that.
Was travel photography and travel blogging as a career something that you set out to do when you started travel, or is it something you kind of evolved into?
Oh, when I started, nobody was doing it that way. I could probably have told you the names of all the people that had travel blogs. There were very few people doing it. Nobody, let me put it this way. It was 3 years, more than 3 years, about 3.5, between when I started traveling to when I was contacted by anybody in the travel industry. There were no press trips. There was nothing. And one of the things I've talked about to people that were doing it very early on is that today people start a blog, day one, and day two, it's like, okay, how do I get free stuff?
Yeah, totally.
Whereas the people that started back around when I did, I'm thinking like Dave Lee and Jody Ettenberg and people like that. That was never an option. We did this. We spent our own money, and we did this because we love to travel. And I think that really shines through as to why people follow you, because you have to show a passion for it. And I think the people that try to make a business out of this, for starters, even if you're relatively successful, it's not a good business. You can go work any, half-ass job, and I hear people like, "Oh man, you're making $20,000 a year." It's like, that's McDonald's money. What is considered successful at this is like a minimum wage job, and people are somehow impressed with that. And when you throw, the cost of travel on top of it, that's really not that impressive. And I think people should do it for the love of travel. If you want to start a website, great. But you should try to be successful, as in every field of human endeavor, whether it's sports or music or acting or whatever. Be successful as an amateur before you then make the decision to try to turn it into a business. Because if you can't do it without making money, you're not going to make money.
Definitely. So something I wanted to get your opinion on was kind of how a travel blog and being very intentional about learning photography can add to your trip, even like with no desire to make money off of it, just as a way to kind of enhance the travel that you're already doing. Or do you think that's maybe not a good way to approach it?
No, when I started, the primary goal was to let my friends and family kind of see what I was doing, right? Because the initial idea was I would travel for a year or two and then be done. I think a lot of people started doing that at first. I don't know if they're still doing it that way. And so, yeah, you want to document things and, and for your own posterity. If you do go on a trip around the world, it's going to be a big part of your life that you can look back on no matter how long you spend traveling. You're going to want to see photos and video and things you wrote from your trip. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And having a website can certainly help in that.
Something that's been interesting for me as I've kind of maybe just like taken the initial steps in learning photography is just I feel like I have more excitement to go out and see things and pay a lot more attention to the things I am seeing because I'm thinking about it, not just, okay, I'm looking at it, but like, oh, how can I take a good photo of this? What is out there? Like, how can I set myself up or go to a different angle that makes this a really good photo? And I found it's interesting because my opinion before you go out and you see like, I don't know, for example, you go to Patagonia or something and you see a crowd of people at like at the Torres del Paine taking the one photo with them and the mountain behind them. And kind of just have this maybe sense of disillusionment where you're like, oh, everyone's just trying to like steal these moments. They should be enjoying it, being in the present moment. But my experience as I've gone and learned photography is that it can kind of enhance your experience. So that's kind of where I think it's a great way to enhance your travel.
I absolutely agree because you're looking for things that other people may not be looking at. A lot of people, they just want to document the fact that I was here, which is why they take selfies, as opposed to if you're actually trying to photograph it without you being in the shot, you're trying to, look at it in a different way and maybe you walk around it a little bit or you look for details that other people aren't looking at. If you're at a cathedral, you're going to look for a gargoyle or something on the outside. I've been to a lot of places, and the funny thing is, most of my memories are not of taking photos; it's of being in the place. And when I go back and look at the photos, I remember being there. I don't remember taking the photos. So I've never understood this idea that it takes away from it any more than I don't know why the epitome has to be just standing there staring at something.
Yeah.
Which is really what they're saying, right?
Yeah. I think that there is like a balance, I guess, with so much social media now. Like you see people kind of like there, they take their photos. It's like they enjoy the moment. Then they get their selfies with it. And then they, hop on Instagram and do their Instagram story, hop on Snapchat, do their Snapchat story, maybe like check in Facebook Live. It's like all these social media things, I think, are kind of like the blurred line for me where I'm like, at what point is it becoming about like, hey guys, I'm here. Like, look at what the cool stuff I'm doing versus me being like, wow, this is really beautiful. Like I'm figuring out how I can capture this in the best way possible from my memories.
I never, if you go and look at like my Instagram feed or my Twitter feed, I pretty much never take photos of food. You might find one or two examples over the course of a decade that I've done that, but I pretty much never do it. I never take selfies. And I've also come to sort of put a limit on the amount of social media. So I've made a conscious decision. I'm not going to do anything with Snapchat because it's a treadmill, because it's all ephemeral. Everything disappears in 24 hours. So you constantly have to be doing stuff. And the demographic of Snapchat is not at all what I want to attract. It's people that don't travel much and don't have a lot of money. I see no reason. No, I mean,
it is for sure.
I mean, yeah, it's just like so young, that group of people.
I I go on national parks, or if I go on an expensive tour with a company or something, I'm in my 40s and I'm one of the younger people on the trip because it's the retired dentists that have the money and the time to be traveling. And those are the people I'd rather attract because they got money. And, they're more apt to be doing the type of travel that I'm interested in. But anyways, I'm not bothering with Snapchat. Instagram's been very successful because it's visual. Facebook, I don't really put a whole lot into anymore simply because they throttle who you can reach. And so you have to pay to reach your audience. And if you have to pay to reach your audience, there's no point in having an audience because you can just run an ad.
Yeah.
So there's no point in having a big audience. I grew my audience on Facebook, and what's the point? It's just a vanity number. Twitter engagement there is horrible. So, Instagram is a huge part of what I do now. And, I'll have stuff cross-posted to those other platforms, but it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that sort of mentality around it because I think that most people who have a page on Facebook can attest to the fact that the Facebook algorithms are terribly annoying when that there's, people who want to see your stuff and Facebook's like, nah, you got to pay for that.
And the other thing I found is that the longer I do this, a lot of people get into blogging, I want to get all the page views and I got to get followers and blah, blah, blah. Quality really matters. I mean, it really, really does. Because what you want, I'm going to be launching an online course in travel photography soon. And I have easily 100 people that have reached out to me, of my followers, that said, yeah, I want to buy this course. I want to learn how to do photography from you because I've been seeing it for a long time. Whenever I travel somewhere, I get people that come out to meet me, to meetups, or they want to have drinks or dinner. And that kind of devoted fan base is what you really want. The people that want to hear what you have to say, who truly are interested in you. And that's just a tiny percentage. I have like 170,000 people that follow me on Twitter. I would say half of that 170,000 is garbage. It's bots, it's porn accounts, it's people that have canceled their accounts. It's just crap. And that's just Twitter. That's just the way it is. And of that remaining number, you're not online all the time. So unless you see a tweet while you're on Twitter, you're probably going to miss it. Most people don't scroll back and look at everything. So it's not, it's only going to be a small percentage of those people. And how they follow you matters. And I'm trying to use social media to bring people into my email list where I can reach out to them and I can control the platform. And I really think that's the best platform.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that as well.
Yeah, and definitely interested in the online photography course. Anyone who's been on your Instagram page would probably be interested in that. There's just some amazing photos on there.
That's the idea. and I should say, one of the other problems with people that run blogs is they're getting almost all of their money from doing promotion and marketing services for destinations and companies in the travel industry. There's nothing wrong with that. I've done it. I'll continue to do it. But I don't want to be reliant upon that. And doing the course, I might be doing a conference for my readers next year, doing some tours and workshops and things like that where you're getting money directly from your audience, really is kind of liberating in a way.
Yeah. In
that it's just between you and there are so few travel bloggers, so few who make money that way, that, they view their clients or their customers as being these companies in the travel industry. And that's who they're trying to please. I'm like, no. That's not your customer. It's the people that follow you. That's the people you should be trying to please. Because if you don't have that, then, and I think there's more and more destinations and companies that are waking up to the fact that a lot of the people they're working with are really not that influential, even if they have numbers.
Yeah. And there's something like, just when your incentive is always going to be to the people who are paying you. So if that's always, tourism boards or resorts, that type of thing, it's like you're selling your audience to them. And there's something that feels like more integral about creating value for the people who like you and just kind of enhancing that community.
And like I said, I don't have a problem with it. I'm not saying it's wrong or anything else. I've done it and I'll do it in the future. But like you said, you have a limited amount of capital with your audience, right? And the more you sell, the less attractive you become that people want to follow. If everything is promoted and everything is sponsored, nobody's interested in. Nobody's going to watch a cable channel that has 24 hours of commercials. And if you turn your website into that and that's who you are, you're doing the same thing. So you need to be selective about who you work with and how many of those things you do. And that's why I want to start offering products and other things and working directly with my readers, because if I do those things in the future, working with companies, I'm only going to do a few of them. I'll be very selective. I'll do it with the best companies and do it for more money because there'll be more exclusivity in working with me.
Yeah, that's great. It's something that as we kind of like went from, okay, we're doing this travel podcast as a hobby that we really love because we want to share our travel experiences and the things we learned, to like, oh, wow, there's money in this. And then being like, oh, we don't really want to just like sell out our audience to things that we don't really want, like that we're not really like excited about, because our audience has been built up organically based on people enjoying the things that we do because we like doing them, not because somebody paid us to do them, you know?
Yeah, I've been doing a podcast now for 9 years.
That's amazing.
This Week in Travel, and we have made, so it's myself, Chris Christensen, and Jen Leo. We've done over 200 episodes, and in the 9 years we've been doing it, we have made a grand total of $0.00 on the podcast. So the question is, why are we doing it? And the answer is, it has allowed us, it's opened up a ton of doors. We've been able to meet people. Like, I've never talked to you guys before this podcast, have I?
We saw you speak in Manila, but
in the Philippines,
we never actually like talked.
Yeah, but
face-to-face.
I mean,
yeah.
So having this podcast and inviting me on the podcast was a great opportunity. Mm-hmm. And that's what we found hosting our podcast. We've been able to talk to Samantha Brown and Pauline Fromer and a lot of people that, maybe we never would have talked to before. And it's been a great vehicle for doing that. So it's definitely been worth our time. And, like this podcast, you don't got to really put a lot of work into it. You hit record, you talk,
you
hit stop.
You talk about things you love as well, which is like, that's kind of like living the dream, right?
Yeah, and the return, because it's about, I don't know, maybe 2 hours of work for an episode compared to trying to write out and flesh out a really good article. It's just, I feel like the return's way higher on a podcast.
Well, because it's more engaging. I meet people all the time, and the thing they mention first is the podcast, which is odd because we don't have nearly as many people listening to the podcast as I do people following me on social media or reading my website. But they mention the podcast first because they hear my voice. You can tell voice inflection. It's just much more personable. And I'm sitting in their ears while they're driving or jogging or whatever they're doing for, 45 to 60 minutes. And they get to know me better than if they just saw my face and read something online.
Yeah, something much more personal about it. And then, it's funny because it's like when you hear someone for 40, 50 hours, you feel like you know them. And then when you meet them in person, it's like this, it's a strange experience on both sides. Because on one hand, you're like, oh, I feel like I know you. And then they're like, I don't know you. I want to jump a little bit back into your story and to kind of the moment or the shift when you went from, okay, this is going to be a 1-2 year trip. How long into it were you kind of thinking, this might not be a year or two, this might just be something I keep doing for a long time?
It kind of started, so I was, like I said, I started in the Pacific and I was just island hopping. So from March until December, in December, I found myself in Hong Kong, and I kind of just had this come to Jesus moment where I was like, I can pretty much tell you the names of everybody reading my website because not a lot of people were reading my website. I had run a network of video game websites, and at one point across the network, we were doing 50 million page views a month.
Wow.
It was a whole bunch of gaming websites and forums and stuff like that. So that's it, kind of an inflated number, but it was 50 million. And I was, so I knew what good traffic was, and I wasn't even close to that. So I realized, okay, I should either quit doing this or I should think about how I could turn this into something. And at the time, like I said, nobody was doing this as a business. There were some user-generated content sites like TripAdvisor and some other sites that eventually kind of they started out as really small independently owned sites that became something, and they got sold for lots of money. But as far as like blogging and someone actually traveling, no one really did it. And so I had some business experience. I had no experience in the travel industry, none in publishing, any of this stuff. I went and bought every travel magazine I could find. I kind of did an analysis of the magazines. One of the conclusions I came to is that nobody was reading these magazines for travel planning purposes. They were reading for basically pornography. They were reading about places they would probably never visit in their life because each magazine was talking about 35 different countries in each issue. And most people will never go to 35 countries in their life. So, and the other thing I realized was eventually all the magazines would die, which I still believe is true. And it's been happening slowly. Mm-hmm. And what matters is just if you have an audience, the money will come to you. So that's what I focused on, just growing my audience. At the time, it was everyone was worried about RSS subscribers. So I grew that. And then it became Twitter followers and that stuff. And I focused on a lot of those things. And eventually I kind of, really just kind of put a lot of my energy into photography.
And is that
just kind of what I'm...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying I think most people, that's what they know me for. If I go to a conference or something now or I meet people, that's usually the first thing that they'll mention is photography.
Okay, cool. I was just going to ask if starting your focus on photography was where you saw sort of your readership go up, or was it just kind of steadily growing as the longer you did it?
Oh, the longer I did it, absolutely. Because when I started, I would tell people, I'm going to travel around the world. And people were like, that's great. And then I was like, I've been traveling around the world for 6 months. And they're like, wow, that's impressive. And the longer I did it, now I'm to a point where I've been doing it basically 10 years. And I say, yeah, I have an apartment now, so I'm not, traveling full time, but I did for 9 years. And when I would tell people that, it was just like, holy shit. They've never met anybody that's traveled that long, or they've met anyone that has been to so many. They've never met someone as well traveled. And so the story gets better, and just having that meta story gets people interested right away. Yeah.
Do you think for somebody who's listening, who's like, I want to start a travel blog and, become like Gary, like I want this to be my life. What are some tips that you could give somebody like that? Because I feel like it like you said earlier, it really can't happen overnight.
No. Well, if you want to do it like me, you need to save up some money. And there's a lot of people that I'd say most of the people when they start doing this are in their 20s and they've not saved up any money. They've not had a career. They haven't had a real job. So it's not as if, someone by the time they're 50 and they've had 30 years working somewhere and they've saved up some money and they bought a house and they have some assets. A lot of people, when they're younger, don't have that. Nothing wrong with traveling in your 20s, and you're going to travel. You're going to do more backpacker stuff. You're going to stay at hostels, things like that. And I think you just need to kind of have a budget, have an idea of what you're going to do. Traveling for a decade probably is not something people want to plan. And quite frankly, to be honest, I don't think most people really want to do it. And I think once they get on the road, they would discover that it's not, yes, maybe you can travel for 3 to 6 months. But I know a lot of people that went out with that intention and they kind of gave it up after a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's kind of like an idolized lifestyle. Like it's like, oh wow, you're like seeing all these cool places, but especially in, social media world, it's like you kind of see the capture of these really great moments through Instagram or Facebook. And it's like, there's a lot of things that are really, really uncomfortable and not so great about being on the road.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love what I do. I do it for that reason. If I didn't, I wouldn't do it.
Right.
But there's an unspoken side to it that most people are simply not aware of. And, I was gone for 10 years. So I live in Minneapolis now. This is where I lived before I started traveling. A lot of my friends have left. The ones that are here got married, had kids. They got their own lives to lead. And you just can't come back after a decade and pick up where you were because, life goes on with people. You lose touch with people. Even, with Facebook and whatnot, you don't see them in person for years. So there's a lot of things that you give up. Not to mention, if you're traveling by yourself, that's a whole host of problems. I know a lot of people that, there's a couple exceptions, but by and large, unless you started dating or were married when you began traveling, you're probably when you're done traveling, you're going to be the same way. Because it's extremely difficult to meet people while you're traveling. Again, there's a couple exceptions to that. But for the most part, it's very hard to do.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, we found community is one of the things that has been the hardest for us, like kind of being digital nomads, like living and working abroad and moving around constantly is like you find a community and then you leave that place and then you keep in touch with those people, but eventually that kind of like fizzles away. It gets harder and harder the longer you do it.
I'm curious, what were the kind of steps that led up to deciding that you wanted to have a bit more of a home base and get a place in Minneapolis and kind of spend more time there as opposed to just traveling all the time?
I was burned out. 9 years is a really long time. And there's a lot of people I know who started traveling when I did who are all in the same position, whether they have settled down in a different country or whether they've come back home. It's just something I think that there's a limit to how long you can travel full time. And if you don't believe me, that just means you haven't hit it yet.
Yeah.
And I got sick of working in hotel rooms. I got sick of having crappy Wi-Fi all the time. So I'm talking to you right now. I have a gigabit fiber internet connection. This is the fastest internet connection I've ever had in my life is in my house.
That's amazing.
So that's nice. I have a nice podcasting setup. I have a very nice microphone that I'm talking to you on. I got a 27-inch monitor to edit photos.
Oh, damn.
It's a really nice, I know. And I got sick of doing it on my laptop. And so now, last year I traveled more than I did the year before, when I had a place. So it's not like I'm not traveling. It's just that now I have a place to go between the trips, whereas before I would have to find a place. And quite frankly, if you end up staying at a hotel or something, you're going to spend just as much money doing that between trips than you're going to on rent. So really wasn't that much of a difference.
It's funny hearing you talk about your podcast setup because I think that's been for us. We've been traveling in Asia since October, but really hopping around for almost a year and a half. And it's one of the conversations we get back to. Oh, it'd be so nice to just have a room where our podcasting stuff was just like set up and we didn't have to drag out our microphones, plug in our cables, get our laptop fixed up, do all that stuff. So,
and it's even like, I mean, you can't see us, but our microphones are propped up on a stack of books from the book exchange at our co-working space. And it's fine. Like it works, right? It doesn't need to be glamorous as long as you've got the audio. But yeah, hearing that, I'm like, okay. Like I could be into that. I could get down with like a solid, nice podcasting setup and consistently good Wi-Fi.
How did you know that you were? Because I think it's something a lot of people who are traveling go through, where they start to feel this, just like, oh, maybe it would be nicer if I settled down for a while. Feeling. How did you know when it was the point where you were like, yeah, I'm just going to do it?
Truth is, I probably should have done it 1 to 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
It was hard because so much of my identity was tied up in traveling and being this full-time travel guy. And you go and looked at all the bios of all my social media accounts and it's had traveling full-time. And so I was concerned, well, if I'm not traveling full-time, what's going to happen? Are people going to, and then I realized I've been to 100 countries. I've done all this stuff. And nobody can take that away from me, right? Mm-hmm. Rick Steves and Pauline Fromer and all these people that are known travel celebrities, I still travel way more than they do. Rick Steves, I think, travels 3 months out of the year. So what I did, I'm glad I did. Like I said, it can't be taken away from me. And I've earned my travel credentials. I don't need to convince anyone anymore I'm a well-traveled person, I don't think. And once I kind of accepted that fact, then I was like, yeah, okay, I can, slow down a little bit.
Yeah, I think at like the end of the day too, this is something we think about. It's, you don't need to be consistent to what you said you were going to do a year ago, etc. It's just you're still, the whole point of traveling originally is just to have a life that you're enjoying, and if you think a different thing would be more enjoyable, then that's the move to make. But I know a lot of people who will set out for like, oh, I'm going to South America for a year, and you find yourself like 4 months in, and you're like, I kind of miss like being at home and going out with my friends. But you feel like, oh, going home, that would be a failure. I told everyone I was going away for a year. So they'll like stick it out way longer than they actually are enjoying.
I think there are pros and cons to both. I think sometimes you do need to stick it out.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing.
When I started, one of the things I realized really early on, and it took me a couple months to get over with, maybe like 3 or 4 months, was that I couldn't go home because I didn't have a home. I sold it. It's gone. And normally when you go on a trip, you're going on vacation, you go somewhere, and then you're done and you go home. In the back of your mind is always the fact, well, I get to go home, whether it's a good trip or a bad trip. And taking away that notion that, no, you're not going home was something I just needed to get over. And eventually I did, and it just doesn't faze me at all now. Wherever I am is just where I am. But most people have never lived like that. And that is something that most people will never experience, to be honest. If they do, they're homeless. So it took a while and to adjust. And I think that sometimes you do need to go through that period of adjustment. And then once you've kind of plowed through it, then everything's a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I think Ryan, you touched on something really important. I think it's like if you're finding that you're struggling on the road, it's kind of looking at like what you're actually struggling with, because I think travel is great for personal development and pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. And is it like, I feel uncomfortable in this developing country, which is why I want to go home? Or is it because, I'm burnt out? Maybe my health's not the best. Like I need something more stable because I've been doing this for too long. I feel like looking at like the why behind that is important for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I noticed is like I went to India last time for the first year. And I've heard so many different people, either you love India or you hate India. And what I eventually realized is your perception of India is all dependent upon how well traveled you were before you went to India. That if you've only traveled in the developing world and then you go to India, you'll probably hate it. But if you've traveled around Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and then you go to India, it's no big deal. It's all stuff you've seen before. It didn't faze me one bit going to India. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people need to adjust the fact that if you go to a lesser developed country, it's not going to be the same that you're used to at home. And the conditions are going to be a little bit different. And some you just have to deal with.
Yeah, that's always an interesting thing. This is my 3rd time in Asia and Ryan's 2nd time in Asia. And arriving back in Bangkok after having not been there for 5, almost 6 years. And it was our first country that we'd been to outside of, North America and Europe. And I mean, I'd been to Mexico, but only on resorts. And we arrived and we're like, holy crap, like we're in Southeast Asia. Like this is so overwhelming. And then arriving this time around, having done, 6 months in South America and all of Asia before. And it's like, oh, I remember this being so overwhelming and I don't really feel any overwhelm anymore.
Yeah, you get to this point. That first trip we did a loop around Southeast Asia. And the first time we got into Bangkok, we were like, wow, this is so chaotic, so crazy. We feel so uncomfortable. And by the time we got back after going to Cambodia and Laos, we were like, wow, Bangkok. This is amazing. There's cars on the road. Everything's works, well. You can go all over the place. So it's funny how your perceptions change based off where you've been.
Yeah, and even if you're used to Southeast Asia, go to West Africa.
Yeah,
it'll be a whole new thing again.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Or
Yeah.
go to Haiti. There's what you learn is Southeast Asia is actually pretty well developed by some standards compared to some parts of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, even compared to like Latin America, I think in a lot of countries.
Yeah.
Maybe same, but yeah, we haven't traveled much of Africa at all, and specifically not West Africa. So one of the things that I really love about travel is that I think there's always something new to see and always something that can kind of push you to the limits of your comfort. It's one of the reasons that I adore traveling.
So we really appreciate your time, and we know we've got a couple minutes, but you've been to, I think, 175 plus countries. Just on that point,
countries and territories.
Okay.
So, I mean, it depends what list you use. So if you use the Traveler Century Club list, which I have on my site, it's 189, but it's 120, I think, UN countries I've been to. But that doesn't include, French Polynesia, Puerto Rico, Gibraltar, Falkland Islands, which are all kind of different things. So there's endless debates on this, but yeah, use whatever number you want. It's around there.
A lot of them is.
On that note, just quickly, I think it's really, really interesting how there's so many different lists of how many different countries there are in the world. And we were talking to an acquaintance in the travel industry who you may know as well, but he was talking about how he's doing a podcast on people who've gone to every country in the world and how much debate there is within that like small sphere of people. I was like, this is so crazy.
Well, first of all, the debate makes sense because politics and geography are not that simple, right? So if you've been to New York, you can say I've been to the United States.
Right.
If you've been to Guam, have you been to the United States? Well, in one respect, maybe you could say you have, but in another respect, no, not really. That's not the United States proper. Well, then what is it? Well, it's Guam, and it's its own thing, but it's not a country, right? It's a territory, and there's all sorts of and here's another good one. French Guiana, which is in South America, is France. I mean, it is as much France as Hawaii is the United States. They vote in the French elections. They vote for president. They have representation. It is France. They use the euro. But if you say, I'm going to France, and you go to French Guiana, that's not what most people are thinking about. They think of the baguette-eating, beret-wearing country in Europe. That's France. So even though it is politically part of France, it's a different thing, right? It's geographically separated from France.
Right.
And so you get all these things, right? These exceptions that you kind of have to deal with because of history that, are just weird. And one of the things I focus on is visiting UNESCO World Heritage sites because strip away all the political borders and everything else. I think that kind of does a better job of putting focus on what are the most important places in the world as far as, showcasing the best that the natural world has to offer and human culture.
Yeah. I really
then it doesn't worry about what country it is or anything else.
Yeah, I really like that. I think that as well, like countries, it's so arbitrary in so many ways in terms of like the culture or saying you've been to, 50 countries versus someone who's been to like 4 or, 10, but it's not necessarily a good measure, but UNESCO Heritage Sites really defines like these are exceptional places all around the world. It's not necessarily, I went to New York and Paris and Madrid.
Well, yeah. A lot of people that have been to every country in the world, that's exactly what they did. They get on a flight, they land in the capital city, they stay there for sometimes not even a day, or they'll stay at an airport hotel or they'll stay there briefly and then they fly out. Whereas I've been to, so in addition to the country list or whatever, I've been to every state in Germany. I've been to every state in South Africa. I've been to every state in the United States. I've been to every province in Canada twice.
Got us beat.
Yeah, I know, more than most Canadians. And every state in Australia. So, yeah, I could have flown into Sydney, planted the flag, declared victory, and said I've been to Australia. But I drove from Darwin to Perth. I've driven in segments from Adelaide to Cairns. So I've been all over the place. And, I think that it's not just a matter of breadth, which you can capture quantitatively. And that's fine. I got nothing against people that do that. But also I think there has to be an element of depth. And that's what I like about visiting World Heritage sites, because if you visit them, you're going to have to explore a place usually beyond the capital city, going into rural areas, going into their hinterland, and you're going to probably see a lot more of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So how many heritage sites have you been to?
320 as of last month.
Wow.
So I went to the Netherlands. I visited their newest one. And then I also visited some in northern Belgium and Flanders, that either I didn't count previously or I hadn't been to before.
So just one last question. Of those heritage sites, what's one that isn't very popular or isn't as much well known, but is really, really worth checking out?
I'll give you one for Canada. A couple for Canada. Well, yeah, this one's a World Heritage Site. Nahanni National Park. Now, you're probably saying, are you familiar with Nahanni, I should ask?
The name does not stand out.
I'm
so
like, it's either on like near Vancouver Island or up in like the territories. It's my guess.
It's in the Northwest Territories.
Okay.
It is, I believe, the greatest national park in the world.
Wow.
It's one of the largest waterfalls in the world, Virginia Falls. In terms of water volume, it's on a par with Victoria Falls. It's higher than Niagara Falls. But it gets 800 visitors a year.
Huh.
And there are no roads. You can't drive there. So it's a very difficult place to visit, but it's one of the greatest places in the world. And most Canadians have never heard of it, which is why I asked, because they're not aware. And another good example is you guys mentioned that you're from outside of Banff.
Yeah.
Banff is an incredibly popular park, millions of visitors a year. Jasper, also great. But one of the greatest national parks in Alberta, nobody goes to, and that's Wood Buffalo National Park, which is way up in the north. It gets 1,500 visitors a year. And you can drive there, but hardly anybody knows about it. And I was working with Alberta Tourism several years ago, and they said I was the first journalist that ever asked to go there.
Wow, that's cool.
They never had any journalists because it's just not a popular place. And I think that, there's a lot of great places like that, not just in Canada, but in a lot of countries that everybody, a good example. I'm actually writing a book on this subject, so I'm glad you asked. A good example is Venice. Venice gets millions of tourists. The place is packed. They got cruise ships coming in. In fact, if you're there in the summer, it is a horrible experience because there are so many people, everything's so expensive, and everything smells. 20 minutes away by train, maybe 30, is the city of Padua. Padua gets almost no visitors compared to Venice, at least. It has the Scrivingi Chapel, which is the beta version of the Sistine Chapel that you'll find in the Vatican. It has the largest public square of any city in Europe. It has a fantastic cathedral. It has the oldest botanical garden in the world. It has all this cool stuff, and nobody goes there because everyone is fixated on Venice, and that's what they know. Yeah. And they just don't know about these other places. There's only a few things that the popular consciousness puts in people's mind, which is why, most people would have a hard time naming another city in France outside of Paris.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic because we've had this discussion about Banff before. Even within Banff National Park, there's, if you go to Lake Louise and Moraine Lake, it's just like a concert, like you're at almost like a mosh pit. But then there's other places which are very similar in there, or even into Yoho, the next national park over, that nobody goes to. So you kind of have this dynamic of 80, 90% of the people going to the same things. But even at those spots, like if you go to Lake Louise, so many of the people are at the one end taking photos. And if you just walk around to the other end, 80% of the people don't even make it that far. It's just like a 20-minute walk. It's funny how it works.
Yeah. And, the view of Lake Louise kind of from, in front of the hotel, and the view of Lake Moraine are kind of the classic iconic views of Banff. And that's what people want to see when they travel.
Right.
You'll notice that almost every photo of Machu Picchu is the same photo.
Yeah.
Right? Every photo of the Taj Mahal is pretty much the same photo. It is a centered view, symmetrical, which makes sense because it's a symmetric area. But, and there's a lot of things like that where it's kind of the same, and people just want to see that. And they just don't know of anything else. They're just not aware of, okay, name the things in Paris. Well, there's the Louvre, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Eiffel Tower, and Notre Dame. And that pretty much exhausts it for most people. And Paris has 4 things, and most cities probably can't even, they get 1 if they're lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, I've recently been reading, or starting to read René Girard, and he has this whole theory on mimetic desire and how people determine or decide to like things based off what other people like, and it's just kind of this self-reinforcing thing. So it's a fascinating topic that definitely relates to travel as well.
It definitely does. And, one of the things I'm really proud of is that I get people to contact me and they say, for example, in Thailand, I love Sukhothai. No one goes to Sukhothai really, even though it's kind of between Chiang Mai and Bangkok, and it's a former imperial city. It has fascinating temples and everything else. You can go there and pretty much be by yourself in a very well manicured environment. And very few people go there. And I've been talking about it. And I've had several people. It's like, yeah, we were in Thailand and we stopped there and it was awesome. And nobody was there.
Yeah, it's so interesting how people kind of just like follow these conventional paths. Even somebody asked us, they're like, we want to get away from the tourists in Thailand. Like, where would you go? And I was like, we haven't done that. Like, it's kind of this like moment in my head where I was like, wow, like, we've traveled quite a bit. We've been to a number of different countries. Travel's like part of our identity, yet there's a lot of places where we haven't gotten off the beaten path.
Yeah, if you want to get off the beaten path in Thailand, I'll tell you where to go. Laos.
Yeah, get out of Thailand. I was like, Myanmar felt like pretty off the beaten path. It's beside Thailand.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, Gary. It's been awesome chatting with you.
No problem.
Where should people go to find out more about you and to connect?
My website is everything-everywhere.com, and from there you can find all the various places you can find me online.
Yeah, and definitely for everyone listening, go and check out Everything Everywhere on Instagram. Some amazing travel photography.
So hopefully you enjoyed that interview with Gary Arndt. I know we had a great time chatting with him. And just quickly before you turn off this episode of the podcast, a quick reminder that this episode was brought to you by you, the listener of the show. We have geared towards funding our podcast via Patreon, which is a crowdfunding platform that allows you, the listener of the show, to sponsor us. So if you enjoy what we're putting out there, you can become a part of our elite community and receive awesome gifts such as postcards from exotic locations around the world or exclusive one-on-one hangouts with us. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can join us at www.theworldwanderers.com/Patreon. Thanks so much for your support.
To find more information, relevant links, and photos talked about in this week's episode, check out theworldwanderers.com.
If you have a question, comment, or feedback, send us an email at info@theworldwanderers.com. Join our community on Facebook at The World Wanderers or on Twitter at WorldWanderers1. As always, thanks so much for listening.
Have a great day.
Bye.